Hello, everybody. My name is Fran Kelly, and welcome to the 16th Annual Savannah Book Festival. This year's festival is presented by the Philip E. and Nancy B. Beekman Foundation, David and Nancy Cintron, Robert Faircloth, the Courtney Knight Gaines Foundation, and the Gerald D. and Helen M. Stevens Foundation, with a special thanks to a grant from Georgia Humanities. We're especially grateful to John and Fran Kane for sponsoring the Jepson Nieces Auditorium today. Before we get started, just a couple of things. David Yoon will be signing festival purchase copies of his book in Telfair Square immediately following his presentation. He is with us today courtesy of Bank South. Please take this moment to turn off your phones, and we also ask that you do not use flash photography. Please don't forget to complete the survey via the QR code on the back of your program. Now, this is really important. The festival costs 30% more this year to produce, so please be generous, and you'll see the yellow buckets as you leave, and just drop in whatever you can. Every little bit helps. We'll have an opportunity for questions after David's presentation. And here's a little bit about David. David Yoon grew up in Orange County, California, and now lives in Los Angeles with his wife, novelist Nicola Yoon, and their daughter. He drew the illustration for Nicola's #1 New York Times bestseller, Everything, Everything. He is the author of Super Fake Love Song and the New York Times bestseller, Frankly in Love, which was a William C. Morris Award finalist and an Asian Pacific American Award for Young Adult Literature. His first adult novel, Version 0, was published in 2021. Please give a warm Savannah welcome to David Yoon.
Hey, everybody. Let's start with a selfie. My friend is texting me about angry Asian men. Just make lots of noise. Look for that later on TikTok. So I'm David. I'm an author. I started out with young adult novels, and I've been writing adult novels lately. My latest is called City of Orange. It has nothing to do with the actual city of Orange, which is a real place. It's a metaphor. And it's a post-apocalyptic, we'll get into it in a second. I want to talk about my work in the context of creativity. Because the interesting thing about creativity is we think it's like optional, but it's not. And in fact, you are all creative, whether you want to be or not. And I'll explain why. So this is me, these are my books, and I'm gonna go over these, and I'm gonna have a quiz. Just kidding. How's your festival going, by the way? I'm having a great time. I've never been to Savannah. This place is beautiful. I just went down to the Marriott where they have all the geodes and stuff. It's incredible. And there's a bunch of furries just walking around. Okay, so, cool. So these are my books. We'll get to in a second. We've always been creative. This is interesting. When you're born, the first thing you do is you listen to music and you make art, like right away. As soon as even when you're like a baby, you're just making handprints. And the interesting thing is, I've been listening to podcasts a lot. There's like the Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green. It's fantastic. And some other things about specifically the Lascaux Caves in France, discovered by 2 teenage boys and their dog in a Frisbee, I think. And these caves are interesting because they're really super duper old, 17,000 years old. Some of the drawings they're thinking are 50,000 years old. And back in the day, it's not like they had air conditioning and penicillin. Life sucked. It was nasty, brutish, and short. And yet, they found time to make art on the walls. Isn't that interesting? It wasn't an option. They just had to do it. And guess what? They made handprints. So, look familiar? That impulse is part of what makes us human. And it's sort of like not just fun. It's not just like a hobby. And it's not something you do in your free time. It's actually, I think it's really critical. Let's go into why. So creativity means you're imagining things, right? And you're imagining what the heck is going on really right now. If you don't try to make sense of what's happening right now, you'll just go crazy. Or you'll get stuck in a loop like an NPC in a game, you know? It's the act of making sense of seeming randomness and finding patterns in it that make sense. And it also imagines what we should do next as an individual, as a tribe, as a species. Because if we can't picture what's to come, then we'll just wander in the darkness forever. This is a really cool magazine illustration from like 1920, from like some German magazine. And here they are, picturing the future. And guess what? It came true. So I actually really believe that science is not as objective as we like to give it credit for. You have to imagine what field to focus on, and that requires imagination. So it's very telling that we found out how to make our phones smaller, thinner, more powerful, but we haven't cured cancer. Isn't that interesting? I can talk to my wife on my wrist like Dick Tracy style, but we haven't figured out racism. It's a question of focus, and focus is determined by your imagination. And I find that fascinating. I'm trying not to pass judgment because we're only human, and these things are difficult. I do think it's interesting and sometimes really, really funny what we choose to focus on. Let's make our phones really thin. Okay. So creativity gives meaning to life. We know this because it gives you like direction. What should you do with your life? But I think it also staves off our fear of death, and I think that's really what it's about. When you're living, and if you're no better than, you know, a cow eating grass, cows will just eat grass and then they'll die. A fish will just swim and then it'll die. And it's not going to think, what did it all mean? What comes after I'm gone? What came before me, before my existence? They just sort of fulfill their biological function and they pass away. We're just not like that. Sometimes I wish we were. It would be so much easier. But no, we're obsessed with what does our slice of consciousness mean? You can interpret that through the lens of religion. If you're not religious, you can interpret that in sort of other ways like general spirituality or neural net interconnectedness, or else psilocybin. I don't know. But I really do think that the meaning that we make is meant to be passed on so that we'll stay relevant in a continuum of humanity. And I don't really know why we're so obsessed with this, but we are. This is just a picture that I think is cool. But even like tacos are, I think, related to our fear of death. And I'm gonna get into that in a second. These are chorizo tacos, they're really good. I'm from Los Angeles. Anyway, you don't have much of a choice in like debating any of this because you are all creative, again, whether you want to be or not. And another indicator of why this is true is when you stifle creativity, what happens? You get grumpy, right? That's at best. You start to get lonely, isolated, start to rage. Because it's almost like not eating. You get hangry when you don't eat. When you're not creative, you get, what do you call that? Creative. When you don't shower, you feel gross. You got to shower. When you're not with people, when you don't have friends, creativity is just as important. And so that's why there's so many forms of creativity. We're obsessed with the written word because it's the best. But there's also painting. This is Murakami, one of the trippiest artists around. This is DJ Steve Aoki. So music is another form of creativity. There's dance, computer programming. Who is this? Annie Easley. She's one of the first programmers at NASA. Sport is a form of creativity. And I want you to think about all these things in the frame of making meaning, and also thinking about your posterity, like what you pass on, your legacy. Science is another field. This is Dr. Wang Stahl. She discovered the human immunodeficiency virus, which is HIV, which causes AIDS, and then she became the first person to clone the virus, which allowed gene mapping to treat HIV. This is what when I talk about science, I talk about areas of focus and prioritization, and that comes from imagination. It's tempting to think that we have rational discussions and we think, oh, we should work on this next. But I don't think they're so rational. I think there's a lot of different factors, and it's very complicated, and it's also very emotional. In the case of AIDS, extremely emotional. This is another form of creativity, is making just dope-ass bikes, right? So what doesn't count as creativity? Nothing. Nothing, including tacos. Why do we make tacos like this? Yeah, they're great, right? But we could just eat meat, just cook meat, no salt, and just eat it. We have fulfilled our nutrition. You know, we are, fueling the body. We may continue for another day. But instead, we bring creativity into it. And I think that is a larger urge to put ourselves in a context, to give ourselves a sense of identity of who we are as a tribe. And then when we pass away, we pass on this taco recipe to our grandkids, and they're like, oh, I make it just like grandma made it. Why is that so important? It's because we are in a continuum, we belong somewhere, and we know that when we die, our life will have meant something. And there it is again, is fear of death. This guy. So it is going after, creativity is about trying to define the big truths in our lives, because otherwise we'll just go bonker balls. The little truths too. So saying like, 9/11 meant this. The pandemic meant this. Like, that was chaotic, and we're still figuring it out. When someone writes the first great pandemic novel, hopefully it has a lot of truths about what was that all about. But sometimes when you don't have a truth, because you don't have the answers to everything, you just point out the question. And you ask the question again and again and again. That's important too. Or you can just say, I don't even know what the question is, just this is important. And just keep pointing at it. This is important. And my wife Nikki and I, we talk about this a lot. Like, we have those nights by the fire, you get some bourbons, and you think you can solve all the problems of the world. And sometimes the best you can do is just point at the issues again and again and again. And I think that's valid, because what you're doing creatively, imaginatively, is prioritizing that issue. In this case, making our phones thinner and thinner and smaller. It is about validation, but I'm kind of wary of validation because there's all kinds of bad validation. Here's one. I put a big X through it because it's like a cheap form of validation, where it's like just very quick and you're scrolling and you double like, and you don't know why you're doing it. I'm talking about like deeper validation, where you're really grappling with issues and really grappling with, why do I do the things I do? That's why I'm sort of like not doing social media anymore. I'm like as much, although my publisher is trying to get me more on TikTok, which to quote Napoleon Dynamite. So I'm doing newsletters, and it's much more intimate, and it's a longer format. It's basically like the internet was in the 90s, which I miss. And so I just think that's cute. This is my picture, like you engage in creative activities so that you are seen by others. And in an increasingly fragmented society where we no longer have tribes and small villages, the internet is our giant global village, and the way to be seen is to put up your creative work and hope it resonates with others. And that way you won't be so afraid of dying. So I just keep bringing it back to death. And then there's ceiling cat, just for no reason. So it's really about finding your place in the world. And not just that, I actually think it's about creating the world itself. I have a cool slide about that. So there's some people out there who say, I'm not a very creative person. You can point at them and you're like, that's an impossible statement. You are, whether you want to be or not. You're all creative, whether you want to be or not. So since creativity is all about imagining who we should be and what the heck happens, you know, putting stuff into context and also defining where we should go next as a species, as an individual, it's important to look at who's doing all the creating, right? Now, when I was growing up, these are some of my favorite authors. And here's some more. These are like high school era. This is like college era. And nothing against these guys, but you know, mostly white, mostly male, and yet they were still very meaningful. I say yet because, you know, apparently, like, I won't get into identity politics. I think that you can learn anything from anyone, honestly, and I think that any author can write about anything they want, as long as they do so respectfully and honestly. But it still kind of makes it difficult to be what you cannot see, and that's why it's important to, if you're gonna define where we're going as a species, it's important to look at who's doing the creating and notice maybe gaps in that direction, and with a really critical eye, as if that roster of creative people is a creative work in itself. So here's the world as we know it. I love this map. This is called a T and O map because it looks like a T and an O. Like you see the, can you hear me? You see that body of water in the middle, kind of making a horizon or an equator, and then there's this river. That's like a T, and then it's in a circle, so it's a T and O. And this is like one of the first maps because they didn't know anything back then. This is a map of the imagined world. And it's like they got most everything except Africa, and anyway. And here's the thing. So this map was drawn, feedback, 5th or 6th century BC. This map was drawn in 1321 AD. So centuries later, they're still basically using a T&O map. And I bring this up because it's related to the subject of canon. Y'all familiar with canon, right? If your original imagining of a particular thing, say Marvel superheroes, happens to be skew heavily toward one group, and say you're implicitly saying that all superheroes should look like a certain kind of person, then you saddle yourself with canon, and then you have to respect and honor and continue that canon for decades later. So you've just created creative baggage. So that's why it's important to diversify the creative class so that we represent the world as accurately as possible from the get-go, because otherwise you might be still making T&O maps 600 years later. So the creative canon is sticky AF, which meant autofocus, but now it doesn't. And I'll get to more in a second. I grew up in Southern California, which kind of looks like this. So same as Savannah. And way back in the 80s, they were already calling it a melting pot. And to this day, Orange County is probably one of the most diverse places on the planet. You wouldn't know it. It doesn't have that reputation, but it actually is. And yet, sort of the role models that I had in media were limited to this guy and this guy. Just gonna flip back and forth. And that's it. That's all, literally it. And I was like, well, this sucks. You know, it made me feel invisible. Well, actually, not just invisible, but very simplified, you know? And it's a bad feeling. And so for a long time, it gets to you. When the larger creative imagination seems to cut you out, then you start to feel like not only do you not exist, but also maybe you don't deserve to exist, actually. And maybe you don't deserve to be seen. And it's a weird feeling. It's different from feeling left out, because you start to police yourself. So that's kind of like, you know, why I wrote Frankly in Love. Ostensibly, this is a book about fake dating. Where are my YA people? All right, so you're all into tropes, right? This is a fake dating trope, forced proximity. And then my dad started to get really sick, and we had a baby. And so those things conspired to make me turn the story into something much more. And I started thinking about when I was a kid. This is me and my brother when we were little. And, feeling simplified and erased, and channeling that into a rom-com because, hey, turns out I fall in love all the time, And I know all the rom-coms don't have people that look like me in rom-coms, and that sort of creative spectrum is very limited as well. So I figured I'll write my own, And then here's my dad, who I miss, and I just had to put him in the book too because I'd never really thought about our generational gap and learning to accept him for who he was. So it was a different kind of love that I wanted to include. So you start with a book that is about fake dating, and it really did start off real fluffy, like a marshmallow. But then it turned out that this creative exploration was really about other things in my life that I wanted to pass on to specifically my daughter, so that she would understand what I went through, and that way she could have a little bit of a cheat sheet as she becomes older, and then we start to drive her crazy, and then I could pull out the book and be like, read this. And that's why creativity is really surprising, is because it defines, it not only makes sense of the world, it tells you who you think you should be, who you want to be. What kind of person do you yourself want to be? It's your attempt at defining yourself. And when your perception of yourself, how people see you, and your own definition of yourself do not match up, then you become Grumpy Cat. So Super Fake Love Song is my next book, or the book after that. And my goal for this was to put a laugh on every page. It's just my silliest, most slapstick book. And it was about, I was channeling myself when I was basically 14, who was like, I'm not a nerd, I'm not just good at math, I'm a rock and roller, or I can fake it pretty well. And that's what the story is about, this guy who fakes being a rock and roller to get the girl. But also I was really good at math, so. So that's funny too. And it was playing a lot with society's perception of me and who I thought I wanted to be. Again, there's that rift of like someone imposing their creative vision upon you as a work, as a person, and you with your own creative vision and trying to assert that. This is my first adult novel called Version Zero, and it's about hackers who are trying to fix the internet because the internet sucks and it has caused all these problems and was not invented to fix anything in particular, or to solve anything in particular. This was actually born, this is a funny transition. So that's me. I used to work in tech. I worked for like 13 plus years as a UX guy, doing app design and interface design. And I just like that we're both pointing. I worked in a lot of different fields. This was particularly about ad tech, which is where, pixel trackers follow your every move and then serve up ads, and they basically sell your soul. And funny thing, everyone I worked with, all brilliant people, we all had ad blockers installed on our devices. So I like to joke that we're like the non-smokers working at Philip Morris. Like, this place sucks. And so this book, ostensibly it's a thriller, but I really was trying to make sense of my time in technology. Like, what did all that mean? I was good at it, they paid me a crap ton of money, and it was fun, and I liked the people I worked with, but what did it all really mean? What did compromising my values mean for 13 years? And so that's really at the heart of what this book is about. It's technology is just the vehicle, but it's really about the larger creative question of, like, as a human being, what do you do when what you say doesn't match up with what you do, when the walk doesn't match the talk? And so finally we get to City of Orange. That's the book that's on my name tag, and it's my latest one, and it's ostensibly about the post-apocalypse. This guy wakes up, he's hit his head or something, and he has no memory about what happened. He knows the world has ended, and he knows his wife and kid are out there somewhere, and he has to find them. But it's not really about that. What it really is about is this. I wrote this book. My wife made me do it. It's like, She's like, you're doing NaNoWriMo. You know what that is? National Write a Novel Month? Where are my NaNoWriMos at? There you go. It's where you haul ass and you write 55,000 words in 1 month. And it's like a nerd marathon. Because when you reach the finish line, you're just like, it's an amazing feeling. But she made me do this. She's like, you're going to write a novel. You're going to get over your fear of novels. And I'll single parent. So she took care of our baby. She made me write day and night, and I did it. People call this a quarantine book. And it's not really. It's about the quarantine that sort of happens when you have a kid. Who has kids? You know, right? The first year when you have a kid, you're in quarantine. We walked around the same block over and over again. We had the same stupid meals, you know? And we lost in touch of all our friends. We just watched White House Down, like last week, and we're like, why have we never heard of this movie? We're huge Channing Tatum fans. Oh, that was when Penn was 1. That's when our daughter was 1. Okay, we didn't know anything. And so that's what this book is about, really. And it's, you know, when I had our daughter, I became really aware of what matters in life. And it's all the, you know, bullshit of my 30s and 20s seems so silly. You know, I used to get really upset if I got a stain on my favorite shirt in my 30s, and then I had a kid. And I was like, oh, well, that's dumb. My parents started to mean a lot more. My brother and my wife's sister, just family. Food, exercise, just the basics started to mean a lot more. And our love just became so much bigger that you start to realize there's so much more at stake now. Getting married was bad enough. Now you have a kid, and there's so much at stake. And so my first thought, of course, is, what if you lost it all? What would you do? Like, we play this game late at night in bed. We're just like, what would you do if I lost a leg? What would you do if I were a head in a jar? What would you do if, you know? And then eventually it gets to, what would you do if me and Penny died? And we're like, shut up. But my joke was always, I would live in a van by the river, right? That's literally the genesis of this book. It's like, what would you do if you lost everything? Not like just, you can talk about it in terms of like the world ending. That's a form of apocalypse, but there's also a deeper internal apocalypse. I always think about, like, what about the people who lost their families in The Last of Us? And that story, you know, I think it's on a really intimate personal level of exploring loss and then just how do you keep going. And you know there's all these apocalypses. There's just the horrible, you know, earthquake in Syria. How did those people go on? The apocalypse is a useful concept for turning the world upside down and seeing what sticks, what's important. And also, how do you imagine a new world from all of that to define yourself in the future? Because otherwise, you're undefined, and you'll probably lose your mind. So that's what the book is about. It's funny. It sounds not, but it is. And so yeah, all these are attempts at sort of drawing the map of the world in my mind. Like, what does the world look like? What should it look like? I like this picture of the world because normally we're used to seeing the world like North America, South America, and this is not that. It's sort of like the Middle East, but then the equator is tilted almost vertically. It's an unusual perspective, and that's also a feat of imagination, how we imagine the world, because there is no up and down in space, but for what we define it to be. So yeah, validation, sure, but also I think the creative act is about figuring out where you should go next and what to leave your loved ones after you're gone. This is my wife. Isn't she pretty? This is Nikki. And yeah, talk about blazing a trail. She was the first black woman to hit #1 on the YA New York Times bestseller list. So we're pretty proud of that. And these are her books. We met in writing school, and we're in our first workshop together. Let's see, she was channeling Ann Beatty. I was channeling Haruki Murakami. It was fun. And ever since then, you know, we pretty quickly discovered that we're both romantic goobers. We love rom-coms. And we also quickly, would talk about like, well, why are people like us never in rom-coms? Other than like the sassy sidekick or the sonogram tech, It's a girl. We're gonna have a girl. Check this out. So we started our own imprint called Joy Revolution. Here it is. And it's a publishing imprint within Random House, and it's sort of dedicated to solving the gap in what we think is the gap in imagination. So right now, or up until very recently, and it's more recent than you think, people, kids, the popular imagination for, say, a black woman was very limited about what that person could be. And for an Asian man, that is very, very limited. And is usually limited to stories about trauma. One of the funniest comments I ever got for Super Fake Love Song was, this book made me laugh out loud, but I didn't learn a lot about Korean culture. So which is also funny and hurtful, but funny. It can be both at the same time. And so there's this whole like spectrum of life. And for people of color, oftentimes it's just sort of that narrow band in like the ultraviolet range, which is all about trauma. And that's not, it sucks, and it's also kind of not true, because there's all this other experience that is not being represented on screen and in books, in video games. And so we're trying to just fill that gap with stories about kids just falling in love and making mistakes and getting stupid. Because that's what happens. I grew up with a bunch of like Asian dude meatheads. And one of them, interestingly, was from France. So he was Korean American, but with a French accent. And he played football. He was huge. And he had like the hottest cheerleader as his girlfriend. And so this kind of stuff you never see in media. And what it does is it expands, when you read stories like this, it expands your own imagination of what the world is and what it can be. And then we can collectively decide, okay, where are we going to go next as a species of human beings? And who is important and who gets to contribute. Highly Suspicious and Fairly Cute is by Talia Hibbert, who's an adult writer. This hit the New York Times bestseller list. Was so proud. We were proud parents. We got to make the call as publishers to the author and scream. Queen Bee is a historical, it's like Bridgerton meets Gossip Girl. So it's a bodice ripper, We're really psyched for that. You Bet Your Heart is Enemies to Lovers, and House Party is exactly what it is. It's the craziest party of the year. And they're all totally normal stories. Nothing like particularly identity politic-y about them. They just happen to star people of color. That's it. Our mission is extremely simple. And we also have a production deal with anonymous content under the banner of Universe. Get it? Universe? Where we're talking about film and TV. Same thing. Just like people of color, just in stories that are not specifically focused on trauma, because we get to experience all the rest of life. We get to have our full breadth of humanity. That is an act of imagination. And if you don't allow for that spectrum of imagination, then like what I mentioned earlier, is people of color will start to self-limit. They'll start to police themselves and think, okay, I'm only worth a story of trauma, so I'm only going to tell stories of trauma. And that's kind of sad. Let's not do that. Let's depict the world accurately for what it is. And pass on our legacy to our kids, so we're not so scared when we die. This is my daughter. We're out in front of the Library of Congress, and she's a huge book nerd too. She demanded I buy her a notebook like twice a week. It's bad. But it's for her. I want her to know that she is not separate from the collective imaginative experiment that is humanity, but she's part of it. And she's an agent of change, and she deserves to be there. So that's my talk. Thanks, you guys. I love questions. Hit me with questions.
Anybody have any questions? We'll get a mic to Mandy up there. Can you talk loudly?
I can just talk loudly if that's good.
Okay.
I'll try to make this like a concise question. I'll
That's a great question. Yeah, sure.
So it was my same question too. Like, so my kids are Korean. My husband's Korean. My husband's like, I can't.
We're everywhere.
Like, he's like, I can't write. Please write the story. One of the books I'm writing is a YA about half Korean kids growing up in the middle of Georgia, Alabama. I had someone tell me though, you can't write. You don't know that experience. You can't write it. Well, my husband's like, screw them.
That, that's pretty mean, man. Who said that?
I'm not gonna write that book, so I need you to do it. But on that same thing, writing people who aren't you, but like I also want my kids in a book. So
Exactly, right? Because you want them to know that their lives meant something and that they matter. Like when people say like Black Lives Matter, you matter, it really is about like you get to define where we go next. It's not just like you have a right to exist and a right to live, although that's important, but you also have a right to contribute to what we decide to focus on. Let's make our phones even thinner, whatever. I think that you can write about whatever you want, honestly. Any character you want. Nikki has put Korean characters in her books, and I put Black characters in my books. You just have to know what you're talking about. And if you don't, make some Black friends, make some disabled friends. And if you can't, then you have the internet. Lots of people you can talk to. And start on Reddit. Don't start on Reddit. But you know what I'm saying, right? You just do it like, do it to others, all right? If someone wrote a story about a white woman and it was just Karen City, like, you would be like, this is stupid, I hate this. It's well, actually, in House Party, there is a Karen who shows up and her name is Karen. But she is drawn so sympathetically and she just wants to be a teenager again. And she's 40 and she's like, my life is over, and there's this noisy party, and she wants to complain about it. She wants to be like, I want to see the manager. But then she's like, wait, this is awesome. And then she just starts, not to spoil it, I'm spoiling it, but like she starts partying with him. It's a beautiful moment. So like, that's a respectful way of writing about a character that respects their humanity and their failures and desires and faults and good qualities. So as long as it's not a caricature, you can have a cliche as long as there's other characters to sort of even it out. If all your Mexican characters are narcos, that sucks. If you have a housewife, a musician, a doctor, and then a narco, you're good. You know what I mean?
Okay, well, my name is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
Before my question, I just want to thank you for all you're doing to get diverse characters out there. It is so important. I mentor.
Oh, thanks. I hope it works.
I do too. And I love reading and seeing other people that are different from me in books. So it's wonderful. My question is, I did not know you and Nicola were married. Obviously, I must not have paid much attention. How do you split this job of writing and parenting? What's your process?
What's our parenting process?
Yes.
Like she used to work in finance. So she used to work for the devil. And I can say this freely, they're awful people. And she was like, I have to become awful too, just to survive. But fortunately she quit. I worked in tech, I loved my job, everyone was nice, but still I walked away. I was like, writing is the real work, because we're defining who we are. And we're asserting, like, I don't want to say asserting because it feels like a power grab. It's really like, we want to contribute too, And so when she goes deep, she was just on deadline for her adult debut, which is phenomenal. You're going to die. It's Black Stepford Wives. She gets deep in it and she just like forgets to bathe, Like I have to do all the housework. And I'm used to it. And then when I'm on deadline, I'll do the same thing. And so we get used to that. We're trying to get better at that kind of thing. But when we've adjusted our writing schedules to just be during the school hours now that our daughter's 10. And then beyond that, we have to turn it off. It's actually good. You want your fields to lie fallow. Because we used to just obsess about our work. And then we'd overwork it. I don't know who's into art, but when you overwork a piece, then you start to tear the paper and it just looks ugly. Like you can do that with writing too. And so it's nice to have boundaries and approach it like the small business that it is. Who's an aspiring writer? Nice, okay. Little unknown fact about writing is when you write, you're actually starting a small business. And you need to be your best boss. You can be like bad boss and work all the time, and never celebrate anything, and never take breaks. Or you can be cool boss and give yourself a cookie every now and then. You know, if you finish a draft, go to Disneyland. Give yourself a raise. And so that's the challenge. If we kept working after hours, then we'd be hurting our kid, you know? Any more questions? No? Can we have time for one more? Last. Oh, sorry.
So I grew up in Orange County, so I'm curious, what city did you grow up in Orange County? Because we don't find it. And what is the connection between the title of your book and the story? Because when I first saw it, I was like, oh, it's a book about Orange County. And then you're like, it's about the apocalypse. And if you grew up in Orange County, the Irvine Company does not create the apocalypse in the OC. So.
Yeah, I love the Irvine Company. Everything is perfect. I actually really like Irvine. Now that I'm older, I'm like, it seems nice. I grew up in Fountain Valley. No fountain, no valley. And City of Orange comes from a writing rubric. What if the world were orange? I had this when I was a kid. You know writing rubrics? Where it was like a writing exercise. What if you could turn into a cat? What if you could fly? What if the world were orange? And I wrote this when I was a kid, and I was like, if the world were orange, it would be scary. I would be terrified because everything would be the same. And importantly, it doesn't matter if the world were orange. It could be purple, it could be green. What matters is the world is monochromatic. The world has no contrast anymore. You've lost all your bearings. You don't know where you stand, and you don't know how deep things are, how far away they are from each other. And that, to me, was a good metaphor for trauma and for loss. When you lose something, especially like something like a wife and a kid, your whole context is gone, and the world becomes monochromatic. And the challenge is, how do you find yourself through that sort of blindness? So it's not really about orange. Great city, but yeah. Thank you, guys.